Chapter 19 The Escape. Ouch! Stop complaining and sit still. Zane sat on the one high-top stool that hadn't been destroyed. Sera stood between his legs, wiping the blood from his face with a damp towel. Zane tried to focus on the pain instead of the intense desire to reach out and pull her into his arms. "You're not gentle at all," he muttered with a sullen glare. She returned his glare with fire of her own, not bothering to give him a response as she concentrated on the task at hand. "You're mad at me, aren't you?" he asked. She huffed, avoiding his eyes as she continued to clean him up. "He started it. And you finished it, didn't you?" Sera was beside herself over the fight. Now that it was over, the truth of the matter sunk in quite deep. At the time it was occurring, she'd been so focused on the present. But now that Lonnie was gone, the depths of what happened began to fester. Thankfully Zane was a quick healer. Apparently the magic that resided inside of him for so long still worked as a protectant. Sera didn't voice her relief though as she wondered if Lonnie was all right. Maybe she'd been too harsh on him. He'd taken a serious beating. She would go see him tomorrow. Zane's gaze darkened as he seemingly read her mind. "I didn't cut him deep and I purposely avoided all major organs." Sera sighed with exasperation. He sounded proud of himself. "No, you just smashed his face in after he was already down," she snapped with immense disapproval. "Come on. Did you see what he did to my glorious body?" He pulled at the tatters of his shirt. Sera averted her gaze from the grooves of muscle, which were permanently burned into her mind. "It's already healed," she dismissively pointed out, her fingers poking at his face to make sure there was no damage underneath. Zane let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a scoff. It was hard to focus with her hands running over his bare skin. "I can't believe you're taking his side." "I'm not taking his side. I'm equally furious at the both of you," she countered, throwing down the rag on the counter and examining his clean face. He looked almost back to normal, except for the fading bruise on his cheek. The monster was nowhere to be seen. She turned and surveyed the remains of the living room. It was absolutely trashed. "Leave it," Zane said from behind her, getting to his feet. "I'll take care of it tomorrow." Sera nodded once and returned to the coffee table to collect her belongings. "I'll get going then," she responded, heading for the door which was no longer standing. She'd made it 2 steps before she felt his warm hand on her arm. "Wait." Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to stare up at him. His face was set with wary determination. "I'm sorry," he bit out. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you actually?" This was the most serious she'd seen him. "Yes, I didn't mean to lose control like that. He searched for words he did not find. "Snapped," she provided. He nodded. "I'm not perfect. But like hell was I gonna let him drag you out of here against your will? I don't care what he is to you, he doesn't have the right to force you into something you don't want." Sera pressed her lips together to keep from smiling at his fierce though explanatory tone. "Fine," she stated, and went to leave once more. "Hey." She stopped again. "Yes. Can I make it up to you?" She stared at him. Zane leaned down until he was eye level with her, giving her his best wounded puppy dog look. Sera, against her will, felt her pulse quicken at his proximity. She brushed it off, trying her hardest to remain cold and unaffected. He placed his beat-up hands on her shoulders and squeezed softly. It was then and only then that she recalled their almost kiss before Lonnie had broken down the door. She wondered if it was on his mind as well. "Come on, I'll make you the biggest ice cream sundae you've ever seen. Besides, we still have a few hours left in us to get through those spell books. What do you say?" She stared at him dumbfounded. "You just got sliced open with a sword and you want to eat ice cream and continue researching?" He nodded, biting his lip. "You're impossible," she insisted, removing his hands as she strode towards the door. Zane's face fell. The feeling of emptiness weighed heavy on his chest as he mussed his hair and hung his head. Her footsteps paused. Zane's eyes snapped up. She was standing there with her back to him. He waited a few moments before taking a step towards her. He opened his mouth ready to once again apologize, but she beat him to it. "This time I want extra caramel sauce and a cherry on top." Zane felt his body relax with relief. He let out a chuckle. "Anything you want, it's yours." He didn't realize how profound his words actually were until they were hanging there in the space between him. He couldn't believe what he was implying, but it was true nonetheless. He wasn't going to fight this feeling anymore. Zane didn't have a lot, but he'd give her everything he could. They walked through the silent streets. Question. Sera turned to look at him in surprise, her mouth falling open into a perfect O shape. His eyes turned tempestuous as he thought back to how close he'd been to tasting those sensual lips before they were interrupted. He'd break Lonnie's other arm the next time he saw him just for that alone. What is it? Before, when I lost control, he started, his serious gaze locked on her. What did you do to make me stop? Zane thought back on the fight. He could barely remember throwing Lonnie down on the ground and relentlessly beating him. Zane grimaced at the memory. The next thing he knew, he was staring into Sera's eyes, the fight all pouring out of him. I didn't do anything, she began, but he cut her off. The second you touched me, the thing inside of me cooled. All my fire went out and I could see again. You brought me back. His voice was low as he confessed with monumental realization. That's never happened before. She glanced quickly at his striking features as they passed under a gaslit street lamp. I'm really not sure, she trailed off. Zane had the strong urge to run his fingers through her hair and let his hands rest on her bare skin. He fought against the impulse as they strode towards their destination. Add it to the long list of things we don't know. Regardless, thank you. She was looking more confused than ever. You don't need to thank me, the ice cream will be enough, she whispered back softly. He nodded once, his face carefully blank of emotion. Inside, he was a raging chaotic storm. As much as Sera tried to banish his grateful words from her mind, they were like smoke, seeping through the smallest cracks of her defense and billowing in. Perhaps, she continued on after a few more moments of silence, I was meant to find you. His jaw tightened at the feeling she revealed behind her words. His heart was bursting with the need to show her how much her presence affected him. I mean, she stuttered, to help you, of course. She could feel her cheeks warm, but thankfully the darkness of the night concealed her face in shadows. Zane smirked to himself. He didn't need to see her to know when she was blushing. They arrived at the diner minutes later through the back alley. Sera went to move around to the front, but Zane reached out to stop her. She looked at him in confusion as his gaze scanned the shadows dancing around them. His body tensed. He let out a low growl. What is it? She asked, peering into the darkness in an attempt to follow his line of vision. Something's wrong, he hissed. In that moment, Sera noticed three sinister figures. One was standing on the roof. The second was positioned on the right side of the building. The third stood just inside the back door. They appeared to be patrolling, looking for someone. Sera gasped. Who are they? They were unnaturally tall and slim, dressed in suits. They looked human, but from this distance it was hard to be absolutely sure. Zane, Sera whispered with a hushed voice. What's going on? He shook his head in wary confusion. If they know where I work, they know where I live. We need Princess. Princess. He shushed her before carefully crouching down and motioning for her to do the same. They slowly crept around the left side of the building. Sera felt her heart slide into her throat as she stepped on a plastic can. The crunching noise drew the attention of the figure on the roof. Zane didn't miss a beat as he swiftly swung Sera around, pressing them both tightly against the diner wall, right next to the glass window that one of the malevolent figures was looking out of. Zane covered her mouth with his hand and leaned in. There was not an inch of space between their bodies. Sera held on tight. They waited, concealed under the small overhang of the gutter as slow footsteps traced across the roof, directly towards where they were hiding. A hissing sound followed. Sera closed her eyes. She didn't dare breathe. She wasn't sure if it was her own heart that was pounding, or if it was the reverberation of Zane's that was pumping against her chest. There were a few moments of unbearable fear before the footsteps backtracked to the other side of the roof. Zane removed his hand from her mouth. Come on. He pulled her with him, leading them to a small parking lot on the side of the diner. Zane silently inched the cover off of a pink classically vintage, but beat-up-looking coupe. Two twin tail fins jutted out from the back of the car, as if they were wings ready to take flight. Princess, she whispered with interest. Zane slid the keys from his pocket. I don't let just anyone meet her. Despite the severity of the situation, Sera covered her mouth to keep from laughing. This car is worth 1,000 humans. He hissed back with playful offense as he carefully unlocked the door, and with aching slowness slid it open. The car let out a rusty moan which echoed through the still night. They both glanced back to see if the noise reached their pursuers. They were in the clear. Sera imitated his stealthy movements, pulling the door quietly shut behind her. As soon as I start her up, they're bound to notice us, meaning, let's get out of here fast. Exactly. Zane threw the car into gear and slammed his foot against the pedal, the tires screeching in protest. He was right, the figure on the roof immediately turned its attention to the sound. But Zane was already peeling down the road with fury. Sera whipped around to stare out at the blackness behind them. No one was following them for now. She turned to Zane. His face was set with grim determination. His mind working 1,000 miles a minute. Will they follow us? Most likely that one on the roof was a tracker. How could you tell? Previous experience. Are they dangerous? Zane let out a dark humorless laugh that sent chills down Sera's spine. What do we do? Sera asked. We get out of town. Now. Chapter 20, pour gas on it. First a sword-wielding lunatic and now this, Zane muttered as he continued to apply pressure to the pedal. What were those things? Not human. I figured as much. What did they want? I have a couple of guesses. Do you think they were specifically after you? Zane nodded. It's too much of a coincidence that you drop into my life, and suddenly monsters begin appearing out of thin air. Where are we going? Zane hesitated, his mind falling to the one being who might be able to help them. It was a chance he'd have to take, even though the journey would be grueling. I'll take you home first. It's me they are after. You should get as far away from me as possible. She was already shaking her head with denial. We're in this together. Don't say I didn't warn you. Sera snapped her mouth shut and turned her head to gaze out the window. They had left the city behind hours ago. It was now nothing more than a dim glow in the distant sky. They were traveling east. How long it would take to get to their unknown destination, Sera had no clue. But oddly she felt safe. With Zane. She was beginning to trust him. It was thanks to his sense and quick reflexes that those creatures didn't get their hands on them. She couldn't stop wondering what they were after. Sera sighed and ran her hands through her hair. It was a mess. She was a mess. She glanced to the dashboard clock. It was 4:30 in the morning. Try to get some sleep, Zane muttered as she covered a large yawn. I'm all right. Still, you should rest. The only thing that stopped her from disagreeing was the look of intense concern he gave her. She nodded once and dropped her head back against the seat with a sigh. When Lonnie cut you with the sword, she began. Are you trying to piss me off? Sera pushed on. Did you notice anything? About the blade? Other than the fact that it was slicing my skin open, no, he remarked sarcastically. Sera glared at him but remained silent in contemplative thought. Why do you ask? When I picked it up I felt magic. I can't explain it. There was this power in it that was unusual. I doubt that Nutjob has any magic. If he did, I wouldn't have been able to defeat him so easily. He threw her a cocky smirk. He fights like a limp fish. Where did he get it from anyway? It looked ancient. That's what's odd. I've never seen it before, and I've known Lonnie my whole life. Maybe someone on the inside? You didn't tell me he was a former convict. He sent her a questioning glare. Sera threw his favorite phrase back at him. You didn't ask. Touché? He scoffed with amusement and then went silent. His even breathing finally lulled Sera into a deep and dreamless sleep. When Sera opened her eyes again, the sun was blinding. She reached a hand up to shade her face. She sat up with a sudden jolt. Every piece of last night came rushing back to her as she whipped her head around to find Zane. He was still behind the wheel and absolutely exhausted. Sera glanced down. Her hand was resting on top of his. With a slight blush, she carefully pulled her fingers away. His tired though intense eyes landed on her. Good morning, she intoned, breathless at his unrelenting gaze. Mornings are never good. His voice was raspy. How are you feeling? Shouldn't I be the one asking you that? He smirked as she shifted in her seat to look at their surroundings. As much as Sera loved to explore the city, she'd never actually left it. She read about the numerous climates and geography of the island, but never got a chance to see any of it with her own eyes. She gazed in wonder at the vastness of the desert landscape they'd landed in. There was not a tree nor mountain in sight. The heat was so intense she could see it materializing and shimmering against the golden sand. How far had they come? That thought had Sera's mind racing back to those she'd left behind without a word. Her mother. Sera reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. It had been on low battery when she arrived at Zane's last night. She pressed against the screen. It was dead. She tossed it back into her bag with a very unladylike curse. She turned her head to look back out the window. She realized in that moment, she was absolutely parched. Where are we? En route, he replied, rubbing his face with his hand as he slowed the car and pulled off the road. The second he opened the door, the stifling heat hit Sera like a gun blast. She gasped against the dry air sifting down her throat. She coughed once, twice. Zane grinned. Let's get some breakfast. We are in the middle of a desert. So, he jumped out of the car and Sera. Shaking her head in confusion followed. She realized once she was standing in the morning sun that they were parked in front of what appeared to be a gas station with a convenience store attached. Zane reached out his hand towards her. She stared at it, bewildered. Zane sighed with feigned annoyance as he slapped his palm against hers, his fingers twining though her own as he started towards the dilapidated-looking building. "Stay close to me," he ordered, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings for danger. "Let's make this as quick as possible." Sera nodded her agreement. "Why don't you get us some food and drinks while I fill up, Princess?" she suggested. "That way we won't waste any unnecessary time." Zane looked like he was going to argue, but she used her hand to pull him back to her. She lifted herself onto her toes and pressed her fingers against his lips. They were much softer than she'd anticipated. He looked at her with stunned surprise. "Get us something sweet." "I'll be fine," she promised as she gently removed her hand from his vice-like grip. With a saucy little smile, she pushed him towards the shop. "Be careful," he warned, debating if he should let her go. "Ugh, this woman," he muttered. There was a clerk inside the musty store who nodded in greeting. Zane ignored the man as he agonized over what to get Sera. There were too many options. What did she like? He glanced out the grimy, dust-covered windows to see Sera at the first pump. She waved to him. He rolled his eyes and looked down, his face filling with color. Zane decided on some sugary cakes and brought them to the counter. He just put them down when he changed his mind. No, he should get her something sweeter. The clerk watched him perplexed, as he once again stalked down the aisle in search of snacks. Sera stood in the blistering sun, the gas pump in hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She turned, trying to keep her eyes peeled in all directions. What was taking him so long? She continued to survey the open land. It made her wary. There was too much space, she was vulnerable from all angles. Last night had spooked her. Zane's urgency to get far away from those creatures was not a good sign. Drops of sweat trickled down her back. Sera's instincts told her to glance up to the roof. She let out a gasp as she stumbled back. Though he was human in form, his eyes burned red like coals, the chalky white skin of his face pulled so tight, it looked like a mask. His nails were deadlier and sharper looking than Zane's, but what really terrified her was his sadistic leer accompanied by a sharp, flickering tongue that was covered in human blood. He jumped from the roof with a swift leap. Zane stalked back to the counter. "Just these and the gas," he stopped. The clerk was still standing there, but his head was gone. Zane dropped everything in his arms. A scream of warning ripped through him. Zane was slamming through the door without a second thought, his eyes frantically searching for Sera. Her face was filled with horror as she raced across the sand towards him. Behind her, just as he'd suspected, was a gry, the tracker from last night. Zane thoroughly recognized the species in the daylight. He let out a bellow of fury as he ran. He slipped around Sera, who turned sharply and dove towards the direction of the car. Zane threw all of his muscle into the gry. The impact was like an explosion, his monster form already straining to be released from his human body. "You're both coming with me," the gry hissed, its venomous tongue too close to his skin. Zane held him off with all his might. "Sera, get out of here." There was no response. His muscles were straining. It was only minutes until this creature overtook him. "Sera," he roared with desperation. "Go." The gry twisted Zane's arm sharply as it extended its shark-like teeth towards his throat. Why wasn't she moving? Was she hurt? Before Zane could contemplate the worst, he heard her sweet voice call over the snarls of the gry. "Come get me, you ugly son of a snot." Both Zane and the gry turned at the sound. Sera was sitting in the driver's seat, a smirk plastered across her face. The gry forced Zane down into the sand, zealous for the capture he was about to make. He stalked towards her with a wicked sneer on his hideous face. "That's it," she egged him on. "Do your worst." The gry cackled at her stupidity, but as he reached the car and lunged through the passenger's side, Sera slid through his grasp and slammed the driver's side shut with a deafening thud. The gry shrieked at her with vile fury, dragging itself across the seat and clawing at the door. Its long nails could not work the locking mechanism. Before it could turn around and escape, Zane kicked the passenger side shut. The monster writhed in rage, smashing its fists against the glass that was beginning to crack. Zane was panting heavily as he stared at Sera with absolute disbelief. "How did you?" But she cut him off. "It's not gonna hold. Come on." She danced back a few feet, beckoning him away from the car. He complied, his eyes leaving the thrashing gry. "What are we going to?" He stopped. Sera was wearing a look of grim determination as she sparked the match against the book in her dainty fingers. Zane was staring at her with disbelief. He could do nothing but watch as Sera tossed the tiny flame into the sky. It soared high before landing on his car, that Zane realized was absolutely smothered in gasoline. "Sorry, princess," she simply stated. The car exploded in fire. The gyri inside screamed in agony as he melted into black ash. Zane grabbed Sera and took off as the fire grew, igniting the gas station and the store along with it. "Are you insane?" he screamed over the roar of the blaze. They were both covered in black soot, sweating like mad. "Did you have a better plan?" she yelled back as they raced across the barren desert. Before he could respond, the entire place blew. The force was so great they were knocked clear off their feet. Clinging desperately to one another, they rolled through the scorching sand, finally skidding to a stop in a cloud full of dust. They stayed locked in each other's arms while chaos burned around them. Chapter 21. Waiting and Wishing. Why do you carry matches? Safety 101. Always have a pack of matches on you in case of an emergency. It was the first words they'd spoken in quite some time. After assuring one another's safety and leaving the scene of the crime, silence had reigned. Princess was dead. Roasted. Cooked harder than a well-done steak. Zane seethed at the image. They trekked across the desert, disgustingly filthy and dying of thirst. Though not long after they set off, the world around them miraculously transformed. One minute they were gasping for breath in the blazing sun, and the next they were knee-deep in a vast swampland covered by thick clouds and buzzing insects. They greedily drank rainwater from cups of leaves, throwing coveted glances at each other when they thought the other wasn't looking. "Where exactly are we going?" Sera attempted to lighten the mood after a short stretch of silence. "I have so many fantastical ideas exploding in my brain, I can't settle on one. Perhaps an abandoned castle? An underwater lair powered by magical fish? Oh, a mountaintop with hot springs and immortal pool boys." Zane couldn't help the mirth that bubbled to his lips. "You're thoroughly ridiculous." "Thank you," she smiled at his back. "So where to?" "We're visiting an old friend." Sera stopped in her tracks. "You have friends?" Ah. Now I'm genuinely curious. They must be so patient." Yeah, you're so funny. I'm sure we'll get along. After all, we can trade woes." "Woes? What do you have to be woeful about?" She smiled serenely. "Absolutely nothing. Except for the swarms of mosquitoes," she added in her head. "And the anguish of never having gotten that ice cream sundae with extra caramel." Her stomach growled ferociously like a wild beast. The slight smirk fell from Zane's lips as he heard her gut groan with hunger. If he was being honest with himself, he was out of his mind with worry. He couldn't believe he'd dragged Sera into this dangerous situation. He should have never approached her that night in the alley. Never let her get under his skin and make him wish for possibilities that could never be. Last night, and definitely this morning, proved that. Hell, why hadn't he just stayed away from her? What now? He was dragging her through harsh conditions and depriving her of food, comfort and sleep, all because the forces of nature continued to work against him. For how long was he going to be punished? Was he to find some purpose worth living for, just to have to give it up in order to keep her alive? What was this torture? She distracted him from his cascading thoughts with her next words. "The tracker, tell me more about him." "He's a gyri. They are known for their insane ability to hunt. They use their venomous tongues to sense, to pick up a being's essence. Once they grab hold of it, they can find you anywhere and they pursue their prey relentlessly. They are also extremely fast, they slither like snakes." "Charming." Sera felt dread wrap around her soul. "That explains how he found us so quickly." Zane nodded, leaving out the horrific details of what happened inside the shop. "That was just one of them. There are at least 2 others working with him. It won't be long until they realize what we've done. We need to move fast." Sera swallowed hard, trying to push down her rising terror. As much as they'd bested one creature with such strength, 2 would surely be suicide. Sera picked up her pace. "Did he say anything?" "The Gry." Zane's eyes hardened. "He wanted to take us with him." "Where?" "I don't know." The more miles they trudged on, the blacker Zane's mood became. The gloomy light was just leaving the sky when it began to rain. The humidity around them sizzled like the unspoken feelings between the 2 wanderers. "We should stop for the night," Zane said, halting his steps and looking up at the ancient trees, dangling with moss and hidden creatures. The marsh was a wet, unforgiving place. At one time it had been a welcome refuge, a place of hidden mysteries that the finders were known to pursue. "You're just curious like me." Sera's words rang in his ears. "Is this where it happened?" she asked softly from behind him. He turned to look at her. Her dark hair was almost black, plastered to her head with hot rain. Her eyes were tired, her mouth pensive. Zane took a shuddering breath. Where I lost everything? Yes. Her face filled with resolute strength. I'm glad we came. Zane gaped at her. Why? Her violet eyes drilled into his soul as she spoke. Because returning will not give back what you've lost, but perhaps it will give you something else. Something new. Perspective. He stared at her with deep admiration as she twirled around, her face alight with wonder at the fireflies that had begun to show themselves. It's beautiful here, she murmured, taking it all in. Zane knew in that moment he was in trouble. Her childlike sense of adventure, her never-wavering positivity and her belief that the most horrid of creatures should be understood, made him question everything he'd ever known. How could he possibly believe he hated all humans, when one like this existed? Do you really think so? She nodded. I do. I've never left the city limits. This is like being in a whole new world. I love it. Well, be careful what you wish for. It's different out here. Monsters aren't as rare in these parts. More magical creatures? Sera looked positively giddy at the prospect. She let out a little squeak of joy and clapped her hands together with excitement. You know you look demented when you do that, right? She slapped his arm in jest and threw him such a dazzling grin it knocked the breath from his chest. Better to be demented than bored. Cheer up. We're on an adventure. Aren't you worried about getting killed? No, I'm with you, she responded automatically. Zane felt his heart soar. Sera bit her lip and looked away. I mean, even if we die, at least I got to see some of this world.
I'm utterly grateful.
Hell, don't praise me yet. We have a long trip ahead of us. Also, if by chance we perish, I'm sorry about Princess. Otherwise, we will give her a proper burial when we return. Zane stared at her. She was completely serious. So serious that he burst into uncontrollable laughter. She looked at him like he was crazy. Who's the demented one again? She questioned with amusement. Zane opened his mouth, his eyebrows raised. He was about to deliver an unfairly witty comeback when they were interrupted. Greetings, travelers, are you lost? They turned to see a head sticking out of a pool of water on their left. The creature was blue and bald. Sera thought he looked like an overgrown baby, though he spoke with the voice of a scholar. No, Zane dismissed, grabbing Sera's hand and dragging her on. She resisted, fascinated by this new life. She realized in that moment his eyes were completely devoid of color. Thank you, she replied graciously as the creature's gaze widened in surprise. We are on our way to visit a friend. My traveling companion here is very capable and knows the way. Very good, very good. I hope you enjoy your stay in our lands. He inclined his head towards her. Sera bowed back. Zane tapped his foot with bad temper. Traveling companion, really? Are we finished here? The rain's pissing down on us and I'm starving. I'd like to find a place to stay for the night. Sera threw Zane a withering look before turning back to the creature. Sir, would you be able to point us in the direction of an inn or some shelter? The creature was clearly flustered by her respectful tone. It would be my honor, Mississippi. But unfortunately, there are no such establishments in the marshlands. You must head, at least 3 days north for that kind of comfort. Come on, Zane tugged on her arm. Thank you again for your time. Farewell. Yeah, bye. Zane threw over his shoulder with irritation as he hurried her along. Once they were out of earshot of the marsh dweller, Zane turned his ire on her. He was starving, anxious, and utterly exhausted. She was such a pest. What's with you? You are the most hazardous human I've ever met in my life, he growled. What do you mean? I was just being friendly. A complete waste of time. Not for me. I've never met a clown. A clown, she pronounced carefully. Zane hissed at her with displeasure. Do you always tell strangers your plans? If you weren't with me, do you know how easy of a target you would be? She crossed her arms and gave him a stubborn look. I handled the gyri back at the gas station just fine. That was luck. Regardless, she pressed on, you don't have to be so impatient. He was trying to help. That's what you think. Not all creatures are like me. No, thank the gods. If they were, the whole island would be burning. He glared down at her with furious desire, but before he could respond, she'd already stalked off into the coming night. She's the one who's burning things down. Especially the walls Zane kept solidified around his heart. Chapter 22 On the Trail. The two Gry looked around at the charred building and billowing black smoke, their keen eyes falling on what was left of Number 3's corpse. The desert heat was nothing to them. Their skin was cold as ice beneath their pristinely tailored suits. The boss always demanded that they look their best. They were here, hissed number 2 as he turned to his leader. He should have had them. He almost did. What went wrong? The boss was going to be furiously displeased. Number 1 ignored him, sniffing the air. Her wicked tongue darted in and out like a reptile in search of its next feast. They burnt him to a crisp, number 2 observed, turning on the spot, his red eyes examining the trail of messy footprints and misplaced dust. Miserable idiot deserved it. Number 1 swiped a 4-inch-long ebony claw against the demolished vehicle, examining the soot and ash coating her long deathly white finger. She sneered at the heavy smell of gasoline. It was interfering with her investigation. Number 3 was right about one thing. I can barely taste it, but it's definitely the same scent we picked up at the diner. Number 2's gaze fell on the destroyed gas station and adjoining shop. He savored the air, filled with the residual of human blood amongst the smoke, but it didn't belong to either of the two they were chasing. How nice he got one last meal, number 2 thought with furious hunger. They'd had to skip 2 meals to go after him. He should have waited for us. But no, the fastest and most reckless one of the 3 went ahead and disregarded orders. They would have already had the 2 runaways if their best tracker hadn't jumped the gun. What's done is done, number 1 intoned as she turned to stare at her companion. What's important now is to return them as soon as possible. Failure is not an option, she spat, her razor teeth gleaming in the setting sun. Number 2 nodded in agreement as he stalked across the sands, his unnatural body slithering in a hypnotizing way, his tongue flicking wildly, searching the air for a stronger trail. The smoke and burnt rubble was dulling his keen senses. Number 1 easily ripped the door off of the car and leaned inside, her tongue stroking the polluted air. The remains of number 3 and the destroyed content of the human girl's bag were all she could find. Number 2 circled around the area muttering to himself for several minutes as number 1 continued to investigate the car for clues regarding their final destination. There was nothing to give her any indication of their next move. They'd have to rely on sense alone. Number 2 finally stopped his pacing and turned towards the east. He stared for several minutes. He looked back at number 1. They went on foot this way. Are you sure? She asked with suspicion. Number 2 huffed at her doubt. I'm positive. Only been doing this for 40 years. He continued under his rotten breath. Number 1's eyes narrowed with irritation. East? Where could they possibly be? She stopped suddenly, recognition blazing on her furious face. Number 2 caught on quickly as he stalked back towards her. No, they can't be headed there, could they? If the tales are true, they are putting themselves in worse danger than the likes of us. The tales are more than true. I was there once. I barely got out with my tongue. Number 1 let out a rare shudder as she recalled the distant and horrific memory. She shook her head and glared at number 2. Besides, where else would going east lead? She demanded with condescension. Number 2 shot her a nasty grimace. That means we have to go into the marshlands? You know it's the only way through. What a ridiculous inconvenience. They'll be near impossible to find in there. Too many scents to distract us. 5 points for stating the obvious. It doesn't matter how difficult our task becomes or how dangerous, we must follow orders and bring them both back to the city, in one piece. She sounded despondent at the prospect of keeping humans alive. Number 2 hissed with displeasure but nonetheless nodded in agreement. Are you picking up on anything else? He questioned after a few moments. Number 1 nodded, her sharp features filled with malice. She licked at the air again. The man-beast, whatever he is. I can taste his connection to the girl. His unrelenting desire to keep her safe. Number 2 scoffed with humor. What could a creature like him possibly want with some human girl? I suppose that's what the boss wants to find out. Before they'd left for this mission, number 1 had tried to subtly ask for additional details on the 2 they were supposed to capture. But the boss had been more tight-lipped than usual. And if there was one thing they'd learned in all their years of service, it was never to push the boss. The Gry's steps were quick, as if they barely even touched the ground once they gained momentum. They made their way into the vast dunes of sand, following the scattered footprints and taste of their prey. Number 2's curiosity got the better of him. Did the boss happen to mention to you why this is so important? Number 1 was the only one of the 3 of Gry's that met directly with the boss.
No.
Just that it must be taken care of immediately. And what do we get for our troubles? Number 2 complained as he brushed a speck of dust off the shoulder of his suit. Number 1 stared at him with sadistic pleasure. If we play our cards right? Freedom. Chapter 23. Seaside Sentiments. They'd somehow managed to find shelter in a hollowed-out oak on the edge of the teeming marshlands. The cacophony of the night rose around them as all sorts of howls, Clicking, shrieking, and various footsteps echoed throughout the boggy land. Sera felt herself jumping at every sound and asking Zane to explain what each one was. She had to admit, his patience with her was astounding. He carefully described each of the creatures she heard moving about in the darkness around them. She'd asked him if he wanted her to start a fire and remove some of the damp chill from their bones, but Zane insisted they stay in the dark to avoid attracting any unwanted attention. "We're being hunted," he reminded her. Zane's eyes narrowed as he recalled how their morning started. "Besides, haven't you had your fill of arson for the day?" They picked at some wild mushrooms and roots that Zane identified as safe. Though the taste was bitter and sour, neither of them made mention of it. Sera was just thankful that she'd gotten something in her stomach other than rainwater. Zane went about placing large clumps of grassy weeds in front of the hollow to block anything that might wander by from seeing them. They slept in shifts, one guarding the entrance, while the other attempted to curl up between the large roots on the dusty, but thankfully dry ground. They set off again just as dawn was cresting the sky. "How much longer until we are out of the marshlands?" Sera questioned as she stifled a yawn and turned to look at Zane's set features. Zane didn't hear her. He was still preoccupied with thoughts of last night. He'd not imagined that their first sleepover would be spent on the ground, though he had imagined it being just as sleepless if not more so, in his own fantasy version of the events. "Zane." He turned to look at her. "What? How much longer until we are out of this bog?" He suppressed his smile at her grumpy countenance. She had bits of twig and leaves sticking out of her normally silken and shiny hair. He decided even in this completely chaotic state, Sera was ridiculously beautiful. He leaned forward, rubbing his hand across the top of her head and sending the debris flying. "Do I look like a swamp creature to you?" "You do," he assured her. She grimaced and attempted to rake the humidity out of her long locks. "A very adorable swamp creature," he added as she glared up at him. They'd only been walking for about an hour when suddenly the scenery around them dissolved then shifted. Sera felt her heart jump as she quickly lost sight of Zane in the dense fog. It was so thick, she could feel it resting on her like a second layer of skin. "Zane?" she called out, trying to conceal her panic. Tight arms suddenly wrapped around her waist. She let out a gasp that was immediately swallowed up by the mist. She threw her elbow back and it connected with a face. "What the hell?" Zane moaned as he rubbed his nose. Sera breathed a momentary sigh of relief, until she realized his other arm was still draped around her waist. The feeling of him holding her did damaging things to Sera's brain as she admitted she was content to stay like this for quite some time. She banished the thought quickly and pushed back against him. "You scared the hell out of me," she raged as he let out an oof. "I like riling you up," he confessed with a low drawl. "You're so good at it I think you should add it to your resume under special skills," she snarled sarcastically. "Only if you add martial arts to yours." Sera huffed at his mocking tone. "Lonnie insisted on teaching me self-defense. Every weekend we used to train before." She trailed off, the humor leaving her face. Zane was consumed with curiosity, but he stayed silent. That was the past. She was here with him. She allowed him to take her hand and they set off through what appeared to be a giant cloud. Sera cleared her throat, pulling herself from her thoughts. "What's with all this fog? We'll be through it soon. How can you see where we're going?" "I don't need my eyes to travel these lands. I'm very familiar with them." "Familiar with fog?" she snorted, making sure to keep a tight grip on his fingers. He chuckled. "It's worth the inconvenience, you'll see soon." "What is this place called?" she asked. "I've always heard it referred to as the Patch." Sera nodded. She thought that was a fitting name for such a dense yet empty environment. They continued on in silence for another 20 minutes. It felt like years. Sera tried to listen for any life that might be around them, but the fog seemed to eliminate sound as well as sight. The utter lack of noise felt like screaming in her ears. She wondered how many travelers had gotten lost in here, and how many of them went insane. "Do you think the Gry are still after us?" "Definitely." "Will they be able to find us in here?" "Not easily, but at least we have a head start." With how quick the first one found them, Sera was sure their head start was nothing more than an illusion. She didn't voice her thoughts, but continued to let Zane lead her blindly through the encompassing mist. Sera couldn't stop the gasp of delight that fell from her lips. They emerged from the fog, stepping out to the most magnificent sight Sera ever had the pleasure to behold. Her eyes were filled with wonder and awe, sparkling like violet gems as she gazed out over the storm-ridden, thrashing sea. Zane couldn't stop staring at her. He was as close to his home as he dared get, the place he hadn't set eyes on in 40 years. Yet he could not pull his gaze away from the woman who was setting his soul on fire with deep, unbreakable emotion. "This is the most beautiful place I've ever seen," she remarked, moving closer to the edge of the cliff they stood on, as if the violently churning waters were whispering for her to come closer. Zane grabbed her wrist in his hand and gently pulled her to his side. She leaned against him, wrapping her slim arm around his waist and holding on tight. Zane felt his heart burst at her closeness, her willingness to touch him in such an intimate way. He gripped her tighter, turning his eyes to the ocean. Here storms reigned as kings. The weather was always tumultuous regardless of the time of year. Lightning flashed in the far distance as thunder shook its way through their bones. The waves were deadly to any who did not know how to navigate these waters. The white cliffs stood out boldly along the shoreline, firmly planted in the glittering obsidian sand of the empty beaches. The wind ripped through Sera as she closed her eyes and embraced it like the return of an old friend. "This," she whispered, her voice low with reverence, "is freedom." Zane felt his chest constrict at her words. She had no clue how possibly close to the truth she was. He nodded, his chin resting on the top of her head as he spoke quietly. "For a very long time this was my home." Sera turned quickly to look at him. Utter sadness was written in his gaze as she reached up to caress his cheek in comfort. "It's incredible. I can understand why it hurts you so much to not truly return." Zane sighed as he closed his eyes and allowed himself to fall into her touch. "I'm going to do everything in my power to free you." His eyes snapped open as he looked at her determined face. Free him? He'd forgotten that was the reason she'd probably agreed to come on this harrowing trip. He'd forgotten that was the reason they'd been thrown together. He frowned, considering what it all meant. Now that she was in his life, he didn't let himself think past that. Once he had control over his emotions, once he was back to himself, none of it would matter, right? His heart ached at the thought as his lips pulled into a tight line. He suddenly moved away from her, reality jerking him back to the present like a punch in the face. "We've spent enough time marveling, let's move on." Sera picked up on his clipped tone and knew he must be torturing himself in this moment, but she let it go. "Where to next?" she questioned, looking over the cliff and severely hoping they'd not be climbing down. She was by no means afraid of heights, but the drop-off was more than a few hundred feet. Thankfully Zane was heading to the left, towards a mountainous-looking cave that Sera had failed to notice, her focus so intense on the ocean. With one more glance back at the rushing waves and deep waters, she turned and followed him. They paused at the mouth of the entrance and looked up. Sera's jaw fell open in shock. "It's huge," she commented, her eyes moving from the high arching ceiling that disappeared into blackness, to the deep-looking tunnel that led into the bowels of the cave. It was also pitch black. "What do you call it?" "The Cavern of Dreams," Zane supplied. "The Cavern of?" Her eyes lit with excitement. "It sounds magical." "That's because it is." He didn't feel the need to add, "in the worst way possible." Zane was frowning as he considered their options. This was the fastest way to their destination. He was also not willing to risk another night sleeping out in the open. Regardless of what they might find beneath the towering mountain, it at least provided shelter and was safer than risking the long way across the cliffs, especially with the violent winds that would pick up once night fell. He helped her down the boulders and into the mouth of the cave. "Do you still have those matches on you?" She nodded, handing him the wet pack. Zane sighed with frustration. "We're gonna have to feel our way through." And so they began their descent. The darkness enveloped them. The only constant was the sound of dripping water as they worked their way over the uneven terrain. "Does anything live down here?" Her voice echoed on and on. Zane laughed with irony. "Not really." "Why is that a funny question?" she asked, feeling slightly uneasy. "You'll see." "Have you been here many times? Do you ever stop asking questions? Do you ever give straight answers?" He huffed in annoyance. Sera smiled through the dark. Zane was impressed with how composed she was. After their last 24 hours, he was expecting her to have a mental breakdown at any moment. But she was so much stronger than he gave her credit for. The pampered princess he thought he'd met that night in the alley turned out to be a fiercely independent and miraculously resilient woman. It took them the remainder of the day to make their way to the center of the cave. Zane estimated that it was late evening by the time they finally stopped to rest. The path before them had suddenly opened up into a massive chamber. A bottomless pool of deep, dark water was situated in the middle of the room. Smooth black stone covered the floors and walls. Sera let her eyes adjust to the dim light that was coming from above. She looked up to see millions of tiny blue lights giving off a luminescent glow and bathing the space in cool illumination. "How?" she began, but Zane cut her off. Is this close enough to magical fish for you? He snarked before explaining. They are cave dwellers, tiny creatures that live off of sea salt. Thousands of years ago, this place was underwater. Anyway, the salt is what gives them their phosphorescent glow. Incredible! Sera gasped, looking around before once again turning her attention to Zane. He was staring at the water with intense thought. Sera frowned. But why is it called the Cavern of Dreams? Zane turned to look at her uneasily. Chapter 24. The Cavern of Dreams. Sera opened her eyes. She couldn't move. It took her a few seconds to realize it was because she was chained to the wall of the diner. Before her stood Lonnie and Zane, both holding wicked-looking weapons. Though it was all backwards, Zane was the one with the sword, while Lonnie wielded the twin knives. Sera pulled against her restraints, but they didn't budge. She attempted to cry out, but she had no voice. She viciously rattled the chains, but they remained firmly in place. She watched helplessly as the two men started towards one another. There was a moment's pause. Sera screamed in silence as Lonnie plunged the knives into Zane's chest. Sera could feel tears burning her eyes like boiling water. The pain was nothing compared to watching Zane fall to his knees as he stared blankly at the deadly wounds. Before Sera could catch her breath, Zane thrust the sword forward into and through Lonnie's abdomen. He also crumpled to the floor. There was blood everywhere as the two men gasped with dying breaths. Sera fought as hard as she could.
No.
No, 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 she chanted over and over again, but they could not hear her cries of desperation. Suddenly the light went out of their eyes and she knew they were gone. Sera felt her chest split open in pain. This is your fault, a voice whispered behind her ear. Look what you did to them. This is all because of you. Sera realized it was her own voice she was hearing. Her skin was on fire as her tears continued to fall, burning her with each drop. Then, the two corpses lying on the diner floor turned their broken glass-like eyes in her direction. Sera, Lonnie groaned. Sera, why did you kill me? Zane's voice overlapped his. How could you do this to me, Sera? You are the true monster. You're selfish and undeserving of love. It's why your father left, Lonnie went on, now crawling towards her with a demonic grin plastered across his dead face. It's because he was ashamed of you. Your mother never wanted you either, Zane taunted, his nails breaking off as he dug into the tiles, propelling himself forward. You were a mistake. No one wants you. No one loves you. Sera was sure how much more she could take. Her body was shaking with terror, their words washing over her and filling her with deep anguish. I'm sorry, she mouthed pathetically, unable to speak, unable to explain. Forgive me. Never, Lonnie spat. You didn't forgive me, why should I give you such consideration? He was almost at her feet. You don't deserve forgiveness after all of the pain you've caused. Zane seethed, staring at her as if she were disgusting. Sera tried to pull away as they clambered to their feet, covered in blood. This is your end, they whispered together, driving their weapons into her heart with all of their force. Zane was back in the marsh. The sorceress was standing over him, sharpening her nails against a black stone. She was smiling. Zane tried to move, but he was wrapped in a net, one that stuck to his skin like frozen metal. Every inch he tried to move ripped his flesh open with excruciating pain. Kill me and be done with it, he snapped. The sorceress continued to smile. I will, but first. She turned her gaze to whatever was beside him. Zane's eyes fell on Sera. She was covered with bruises and cuts, her limp body twisted in angles that gave her the resemblance of a broken angel. Her lips were blue, her skin chalk-white beneath the violent wounds that had been inflicted on her. Zane's scream was one of fury, shock, psychotic pain that made his mind snap with madness. He dragged himself to her side, ignoring the icy anguish as his skin was torn apart. Sera, Sera, he moaned over and over again, unable to accept this wicked twist of fate. No, please come back to me, he begged. The sorceress laughed again. I gave her the option, you know. I told her you either spend the rest of your life with a monster, or you die here and now. This is what she chose. Death over a life with you. You lie. Zane raged. The sorceress quirked an eyebrow. Ask her yourself. Zane snapped his gaze back to Sera. Her eyes were open and she was staring at him with true and utter loathing. You ruined my life, she sneered up at him. I wanted nothing to do with you, look what you've brought down on me. I'm sorry, he whispered, his hand snagging on the sharp net. He was unable to touch her. I hate you. You're a monster, not worthy of me. How could you possibly think it would work? I love Lonnie. I want him. Not you. You don't mean that. Ido. I'd rather be dead than ever let you touch me again. Her words cut him deeper than any weapon ever could. He felt his heart shatter into a million pieces, but before he could say another word, the net was dragging him away, back towards the deep waters of the marsh. Just before he plummeted down, the sorceress spoke again. "You'll drown in this form." Her voice inundated his ears. "You've lost Sera forever." Zane shouted for Sera one last time before the waters of the marsh flooded his human lungs.
Sera. Sera.
Someone was shaking her violently. "I'm sorry," she moaned, feeling the tears run down her face. "I'm so sorry."
Sera, wake up.
"Please." Sera opened her eyes. Zane was leaning over her, his gaze wild with concern. Sweat was glistening on his bare chest. Sera reached out her hands and pressed them against his skin. He wasn't bleeding. He was alive. She let out a cry of relief as she threw herself into his embrace. When his arms closed tightly around her, she realized he was shaking uncontrollably and soaking wet. She placed her head against his chest, her tears continuing to fall as she listened to the frantic beating of his heart. "Are you all right?" he whispered, pulling her even closer until she was in his lap. She nodded, attempting to catch her breath. The dream had been so real, too real. She could still feel the impression of the shackles around her wrists, the deep pain in her chest where they'd stabbed her. Zane was attempting to calm himself down. He'd awoken to cold water slicing through his body. It had taken him several moments to recognize that he was not in the marshlands at all, but had thrown himself subconsciously into the pool at the center of the cavern. He cringed, thinking how close he'd come to drowning in those endless watery depths. He rubbed Sera's back in circles as he wrapped her even tighter in his embrace. "I had the most horrible, the most violent." "I know," he soothed. "So did I." They stayed like that for a few minutes, allowing the present to settle around them. They were safe. They were together. Finally, Sera's curiosity got the better of her. She carefully sat back in his lap with a light blush, but she didn't move away. "You dreamt too." He nodded, his jaw ticking with anxiety at the memory of it. "And that is why this place is called the Cavern of Dreams. It holds the power to play out your worst fears, effectively trapping you in a nightmare. In rare and extreme circumstances, it could even lead to death." He'd forgotten about that last bit, ironically. "Why didn't you warn me? You would have refused to sleep, and trust me, no matter how awful it was, we both needed the rest." She looked at him with extreme doubt. "And you thought this would be the safest place to stay? Safer than the other route we would have taken?" His eyes told her he was not playing around, he was completely serious. "What else is out here?" Sera shuddered to herself. Zane went on. "Since there are two of us, I figured we'd wake each other up before anything too drastic happened, but apparently I was wrong." They'd been so dead on their feet that by the time they'd eaten some leftover roots and settled in, the soft blue lights and constant dripping sound had knocked them both out, even as Zane insisted they once again take shifts. "Thank the gods you woke up," she muttered, her body chilled with the thought of what could have become of them. Zane nodded seriously, his eyes never leaving her face. "Are you sure you're okay?" "Yes. I'm better now." She ran her hands through her hair, shaking off the last vestiges of terror that had consumed her. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked after a moment, an inquisitive look cresting his hypnotic eyes. Sera's reply was quick. "Nope." Suddenly she was eager to know what it was he feared. "Do you?" Zane's response was even quicker. "Hell no." She nodded in understanding as they got to their feet. Zane wiped the sweat and Sera's tears from his chest. He tossed his t-shirt back on. Sera averted her eyes as she once again imagined those horrible wounds. The sooner they were back out in the fresh air the better. She would be able to forget all about the horrible doubts and fears hidden deep in her soul. But at some inevitable time, when they were out of perilous circumstances, she would have to take a closer look as to what the dream, no nightmare, had shown her. "More like Cavern of Horrors," she muttered to herself, taking one last suspicious glance around the seemingly harmless space. Zane reached out his hand with a grim smile. "Time to go." Chapter 25, Forest of Foresight. Light was rising in the sky as they exited the Cavern of Dreams. Sera didn't bother to look behind her. It was not a place she'd be returning to, she hoped. She glanced to her right. There were deep shadows under Zane's eyes, but his jaw was set with determination. "Finally," he sighed. Sera leapt at the word. "Are we here?" she asked eagerly. "Just one more hurdle and we will be home free." He turned to grin down at her. Sera felt her heart warm. She didn't bother to wait this time. She reached out and took his hand in hers before turning her attention forward. "Now this," Sera started with bright wide eyes, "is that I'm talking about." Zane shook his head. Don't let its beauty deceive you. This is by far the most dangerous place we've traveled to. Sera's face fell with disappointed disbelief. You said we were going somewhere safe. I did. He threw her a mischievous grin. But we have to find it first. More magic. I'll show you. Come on, we can walk and talk. Sera was curious as to why he was in such a cheery mood this morning. She grabbed his hand first. Sera was holding his hand. Zane didn't care if 1,000 dragons converged on him. In that moment he was happy. So what's? He was beginning to anticipate her questions. The Forest of Foresight. Sera glanced around in wonder, trying to take it all in. It was neither hot nor cold here. The sun wasn't directly shining, but it wasn't gloomy either. Birds chirped and small forest creatures roamed unseen around them, but the air was still, too still, as if the entire forest was holding its breath for something momentous to happen. It's strange here, she remarked as they walked through the towering sea of emerald and neon trees, the lush carpets of moss soft and thick beneath their feet. It looks like paradise. It does. This is a place that only those with magical blood know about. Even the strongest and deadliest come here only when they are desperate. Sera whipped around, feeling her body fill with anxiety. She lowered her voice. If that's the case, am I even allowed to be here? Zane laughed. Humans aren't forbidden from the forest, it's just, well, you wouldn't travel this far out of your way to a place you didn't know existed, right? Sera contemplated his question. Maybe I would. He scoffed. Keeping on par with your weirdness, I see. You like my weirdness, she threw back. Yes. Ido. Sera looked away and smiled as his hand squeezed hers gently. Will the trackers come here? She wondered as they wandered deep into the majestic forest. They certainly will avoid it if they can, but it all depends on how desperate they are to get their hands on us. Have you come up with any possible explanations? Zane shook his head. That's why we're here, among other reasons. Sera looked at him curiously, his curse popping into her head. She'd pushed that project to the back of her mind more and more. Not because she wasn't willing to keep her promise and help him, but she was starting to realize her world without Zane would be a much lonelier place. She didn't want to worry about that now. First they had to figure out what these guys wanted and how to call them off. Zane startled her from her sullen thoughts. And here we are. Sera looked around. They'd wandered into a clearing to reveal a rushing waterfall. There was a carved stone bench surrounding the delightful-looking pool at its base. She imagined diving in head first to wash the sticky grime and grit of their exhausting journey off of her skin. Later, she reminded herself, when we are safe. Other than the bright emerald forest around them and a few stacked boulders and rocks, there was nothing here. Sera turned to look at Zane in confusion, but he'd already let go of her hand and headed towards the cluster of stones. Is this it? Morvels. What's that? He's the friend I mentioned. This is where he lives. Yes. Sera walked around in circles, surveying the area with a keen eye as Zane began moving the stones into the center of the clearing and arranging them in an intricate pattern. Do you want help? She asked, watching as the sweat beaded down his neck, his shirt sticking to his defined body in all the right places. Just keep an eye out. She nodded and took another walk around again. Nothing. She went back over to him to inspect his work. What are you doing? Zane paused with an annoyed sigh as he turned to her. She couldn't help but look him over. He followed her eyes and grinned. Like what you see. Her eyes snapped back up to his face. The rocks. What are you doing with them? Well, we can't very well meet with Morval if he doesn't exist. She felt her jaw drop open at this words. What does that mean? His home, he started as he returned to the labor, is not of this world. It can only be accessed through stone ritual. If we do not place the stones correctly, the home simply doesn't exist. It's not hidden or concealed with magic. It's literally not here. Oh, she'd never heard of anything so wild in all her years of reading about magic. Zane agreed. So what kind of creature is Morval? A very old one. He's the last of his kind. Has been for, I don't know, give or take 2,000 years. What? Yeah, nobody messes with Morval. He's the reason every monster out there is scared of this forest. Is he that terrifying? She whispered. Zane smirked. Only when he's pissed off. Does he hate humans too? Zane paused and looked at her. Too? Are you referring to me? Yes. He was offended. I don't hate you. I know that, I didn't mean me. Well, what the hell are you then? Sera thought about it for a moment. Special. Zane rolled his eyes at her, but when he turned back to his task, his face was once again lit with a smile. Yes, you are. Before she could ask another pesky question, Zane beckoned to her with his hand as he placed the last stone on the massive circle he'd created. Sera moved forward, reaching for his side, expecting any moment for something to go horribly wrong. The ground began to tremor. The birds stopped their singing. Even the flow of the waterfall slowed down. Sera watched with astonishment as a beautiful stone house appeared through a haze of shimmering mist. She stared. There was smoke coming from a chimney, and the smell of freshly baked bread hit her like a steamroller. She was already moving towards the house. Zane jumped into action. "Hey, wait up. What's wrong with you? And I thought I was food motivated," he insisted, slinging his arm over her shoulders and leading them together. "Sorry, I got excited," she began, but Sera's voice was cut off by the door slamming open with a bang. "Most women do when they meet me," came a charming voice from the porch. Zane laughed as he strode forward, gripping the man's arm with delight. "Morval. Zane, I wasn't expecting you. You just visited, what was it, 40 years ago? I see you still haven't got your fangs back." "Working on it," he said, but Sera noticed he wasn't scowling about it. Zane gave Sera a little tug forward. "I brought someone to visit." "Oh." Morval looked Sera over with sparkling green eyes, his thick auburn hair fluttering in the slight breeze. He couldn't be more than 50 years old, and he looked like a perfectly normal human being, except for his green skin. She imagined it allowed him to blend into the forest around them. "Hello, sir, I'm Sera." There was a second of silence before Morval's booming laughter filled the glade. "Sir. Sir." He doubled over in laughter as Zane looked on in amusement. Sera was beyond confused. "I'm sorry, Sera, it's been at least 500 years since anyone has referred to me as sir. Welcome, welcome." He threw her a glorious smile and continued to chuckle. Sera nodded as Morval extended his arm to invite them in. Sera accepted graciously, if not a little nervously. She looked back at Zane as if to say, "Your friend is as strange as you," and then she disappeared inside. Morval paused. Zane noticed his eyes followed Sera with perplexed interest. Zane had seen that look from his old friend before. It was the one he gave when he could sense something that others could not. Something hidden. He turned back to look at Zane with what could only be described as wary wonder. "Just what kind of trouble are you in, kid?" Zane sighed. "All sorts." Chapter 26. Closing in. "We've been here before," snapped number 1, her lips pulling back in a snarl as she circled the clearing. "I thought you said you had the scent?" Number 2 cringed at her vicious tone, his eyes darting around the foggy marshland with distaste. He swatted at a giant mosquito. "I warned you, this swamp has too much magical life. It's easy to cover tracks. We're falling behind. This is unacceptable." Number 2 brushed the spiderwebs off his suit jacket. "Give me a minute. I can't concentrate on tracking with you constantly complaining." Before number 2 could take another step, number 1 slammed him into the trunk of a rotting tree, her sharp claws closing around his neck. "Do you have a death wish?" He shoved her back, hissing. They were both on edge, having not once stopped to eat or sleep since they began this mission. But before the situation could escalate to one of flying claws and shredding teeth, a voice interrupted them. "Greetings, travelers, are you lost?" They both whipped around to see a blue-skinned creature, his bald head emerging from beneath the murky waters behind them. Number 2 opened his mouth to snarl out a nasty comment, but number 1 elbowed him in the ribs. "What was that for?" he snapped. "Don't you dare say anything offensive, that's a clawin'." She huffed at his look of confusion. "He could rip us both to pieces without breaking a sweat," she finished in a low voice. Number 1 cleared her throat and warily moved forward towards the seemingly harmless creature. "Good evening, and yes, we have in fact lost our way." The clawin smirked. "That happens quite often in these parts, even to the most seasoned of travelers. Have you seen any humans come through here recently?" "Describe them." "A girl with dark hair, a man slightly older with light hair." "Ah, I did happen upon them. Why are you looking for them?" Number 2 went to retort that it was none of his business, but once again number 1 gave him a withering glare that meant, "I'll rip your guts out if you say anything. Our boss is looking for them. We personally have no interest in the two," number 1 explained with uncommon patience, for this was not a creature she wanted to tangle with. While the clawin might look perfectly harmless, what lay beneath the water was surely not. Massive tentacles used for drowning prey, that were tipped with spikes so sharp they could cut through rocks as if they were butter. The clawin placed his blue arms on the bank and thrummed his stubby fingers against the damp grass, as if contemplating. Number 2 was becoming increasingly impatient beside her, but she kept a firm hand on his arm, willing him to not make any rash decisions that would get them both killed. A clawin's mood could change as swiftly as the weather in these parts. Number two's ignorance was showing and it made them vulnerable. It was a feeling that number one could not tolerate. I do wonder what you plan on doing with them once they are captured, the clown mused, his mouth opening with a sadistic smile. The girl would have been a delicious little treat, but so polite I couldn't possibly eat her. Number two raised an eyebrow at his companion. Number one shook her head slightly. That's a relief, you've saved us a lot of trouble by curbing that impulse. Number one nodded gratefully. I suppose that means you're in my debt. It wasn't a question. He went on. Well, if you are hell-bent on pursuing them, I could give you a little hint, but I would require something in return. Number one was expecting this. She'd come across a few clowns in her long lifetime, so she knew they never gave anything away without some sort of compensation. What is it you desire? She asked carefully. The clown's mouth widened to reveal the rotten teeth he'd kept hidden, his milky white eyes practically glowing with amusement. Something to eat, of course. Number one looked around. He could trap and devour anything in the marshlands with complete ease, which meant he wanted something he couldn't normally get his tentacles and talons on. She nodded and turned to number two expectantly. What? He looked at her with weary confusion. A delicacy, perhaps? One I've not had the pleasure of tasting, the clown continued, his eyes also glued to number two as he followed number one's train of thought. Cut out your tongue, number one commanded. Number two looked at her with indignant shock. You're not serious. Do it. Now. Number two threw her a burning glare, but lifted his sharp nail up to his mouth and cut through his long venomous tongue with one swipe. He stared at it numbly as number one took it from his grasp and tossed it towards the clown. The creature's mouth, which appeared a normal size, opened, his jaw unlatching and extending with incredible speed to accommodate the flesh. He caught the tongue and swallowed it with one gulp. He gave a little shudder of pleasure, as if he'd eaten a most decadent meal. He crooned. Simply wonderful. I thank you, traveler. Not a problem. Number one went on with expectancy written on her terrible face. And our information? The clown pointed his finger into the dense gloom of the marsh. Follow that path just slightly north. My minions tell me they exited the patch yesterday morning. I assume you know what lies beyond, he intoned, his eyes showing hesitancy at such a prospect. Number one nodded her thanks as number two stood beside her, boiling with rage. She knew he was going to be absolutely miserable for the rest of the evening, but that was beyond her control. They were to stop at nothing until those two were in their clutches. Thank you for your time, she muttered with a slight bow. She hit number two in the side as he stiffly copied her movements. The clown laughed. Best of luck. You're going to need it. Number one and number two set off, their footsteps silent under the soft, muddy ground. Once they were a good distance from the clown, number one turned to look at her fuming partner. Suck it up, it will grow back. His eyes glowed like furious embers though he remained silent. Number one read his thoughts naturally. Easy to say when it's not your tongue that becomes dinner. Chapter 27. An old friend. That's quite the journey you two have been on, huh? It had been hours since they'd arrived at Morville's safe space. It had taken Sera and Zane most of that time to fill him in on everything that had happened since their original meeting. They dined on succulent stew and hot crusty bread, accompanied by a deep red wine that went straight to Sera's head. As night coated the sky, the three sat at the wooden table of the kitchen, a fire and several candles basking them in a dim and cozy glow. Sera liked this place very much. Once she'd gotten over her initial shock at finding Morville to not be some terrifying monster that Zane allowed her to worry about, she actually found herself relaxing. Her eyelids fluttered every so often at the prospect of sleep. Now that she was well fed and slightly intoxicated, the warmth of the fire was lulling her into a place of half-conscious dreams. Zane watched her from across the table, his handsome features fixed on her completely. Morville, the perceptive being he was, observed their encounters with growing amusement as well as concern. He was sure Zane did not realize just how deep he was in. He'd fallen into the drowning zone. Morville chuckled to himself and Zane's eyes looked at him with inquiry. Morville shook his head. So you have no idea who could be after you or why? He countered with doubt. Zane shook his head. Like I said, Sera came into my diner. She saw me, the real me. We started doing a little research and suddenly 3 Gry are after us like bats out of hell. I'll put out some feelers, Morville offered. See if I can't find who is pulling the strings. His train of thought switched quickly. And just so you are aware, I created the existence charm for this house. The magic is so intrinsically linked to me, and only me, that when there are visitors the property becomes visible to the naked eye. I pledged a solitary life, meaning the more people who reside here, the weaker the magic grows. The Gry will be able to find us as long as you're here. Understood. We don't want to put you in any danger, Sera insisted. Morval chuckled with not a care in the world. The Gry are no danger to the likes of me. He frowned suddenly. I haven't seen a Gry in years. I thought they were almost extinct, he trailed off. It's not like them to travel or work together either. I always knew them as solitary creatures, Zane added. Desperation calls for unique measures. Perhaps the fact that they are so few in numbers has forced them together for survival. Morval and Zane turned to look at Sera, who, although sleepy, was paying close attention to the conversation. You're not wrong, Morval conceded, looking impressed. You know, Zane, I heard a strange rumor about that city of yours. A vast migration spanning over the last 50 or so years. Zane frowned in confusion. Migration? To the city? It's practically empty of humans these days, and I've not seen any sort of magical creature in all the years I've lived there. But it could be possible. Sera turned thoughtful. Zane let out a dark laugh. I'm the only one you've seen, remember? Her eyes lit with sudden clarity. But there might be other cursed creatures like you roaming the city looking for help. She looked too hopeful for his liking. There's not, he snapped, irritated by the idea of Sera's interest expanding beyond any other monster but himself. Morval's eyes were filled with knowing amusement. It might be worth looking into. I heard whispers of a sanctuary of sorts. A place for all kinds of magical beings. But what they are doing there I have no clue. Don't magical creatures usually keep to their own? Sera asked, remembering a passage from an old tome she'd read. Zane and Morval both nodded in agreement. It's very rare for species to cohabitate with another. Thought we interact, have friends or even lovers of different natures. We hardly ever live together. Well, perhaps then there is something much larger at work. Something they are all fleeing from?
Sera wondered.
Or towards. Zane's eyes looked to Morval, who nodded at the possibility. I didn't bother concerning myself with it until now. I will look into it, was Morval's answer. Zane's shoulders relaxed. Thanks. Morval poured another round of wine. He seemed to have an endless supply. If that's all, he went on, I'd like to turn the conversation towards another, if not much more pressing matter. More pressing? Sera felt herself come fully awake at the seriousness of his voice. Yes. You, Miss Hastings. Zane's face fell into a scowl at his friend's tone. He didn't want him upsetting Sera with prodding questions, that was his job. Sera was thoroughly perplexed. What about me? You're not human, Morval supplied, watching Zane as astonishment and denial tore across his features. At least not fully anyway. You're wrong, Zane insisted. I'm not. What am I? Sera whispered, feeling excitement, the anticipation of long-wondered questions finally answered. Zane stared at her. While he was consumed with unwarranted anger, Sera looked mystified, intrigued at the prospect. Morval spoke with grave certainty. In you lies great, great power. Dark power. Have you not felt it before? Sera shook her head no. Her face turning wary at the words dark power. You're still young, but it will show itself soon. I can see it bubbling right beneath the surface. You are close to a life-changing transformation. What does that mean? Spat Zane as he continued to stare at Sera, his mind working fast as he tried to recall anything he'd missed. He was beyond irritated that someone other than him had recognized it first. I knew she was different, obviously, but this? Spit it out, man, what are you trying to say? Sera is half Dekla, a rare and vibrant species that ruled over much of this island before they turned on their own. They decimated their numbers until there were only a few left. Too much infighting. It's said that this was the reason behind magic disappearing from the city. The loss of the Dekla left a once prospering place in ruins. Dekla? Sera repeated, suddenly feeling a burst of energy spark through her veins. She'd never heard of them before. Is that why she can see me? Zane's jaw ticked with suppressed emotion. Morval shook his head. No, that shouldn't make a difference at all. It's a connection to you that allows Sera to see what lies within you. Connection? How? Why? Demanded Zane. This knowledge is beyond me. I cannot tell you exactly why or how, just that it exists, and that it is very substantial. Sera took a large sip of wine. Morval went on as Zane stewed in his own thoughts. Your eyes are a very unusual color. Most Dekla's irises are black, violet is extremely rare. A level of power that has not been seen on this island in centuries. What does it mean? What am I supposed to do with this information? Morval took a deep breath. I suggest you start with figuring out your capabilities. Deklas are known for their immense ability to control powers unknown to all but them, lightning speed and immense strength. They are immortal. blessed with eternal youth. They are extremely cunning. Dekla consider themselves magical beings, not creatures. They are scarce and physically identical to humans. What makes them particularly dangerous is that you'd never know you were standing in front of one until they unleashed their power on you. Sera went silent in an attempt to process this information. How come I never realized? She trailed off with confusion before her eyes met Zane's over the light of the candles. Do you think my father was a Dekla? Perhaps that's why my mother never spoke of him. Her voice faded off again as she fell into deep contemplation. Zane was done with the conversation. He wasn't entirely sure why this new and shocking information bothered him so much. He'd known there was something special about the woman, but this? It suddenly became much more real of a concept that she would be the one to break his curse. The thought chilled him more than it should. Deklas were immortal. What did that mean for Sera's future if she were only half? He stood suddenly. Morval and Sera, both lost in deep thought, looked to him. He held his hand out for Sera, who gratefully moved to his side. He was concerned about how this information would affect her once the reality of their situation set in. His questions continued to build. This solidified that he wasn't the only one the Gry were after. Morval took Zane's cue. Enough for tonight. You two get some rest. We will see what can be done about this in the morning. You're welcome to stay for as long as you need. Zane nodded his thanks, tucking Sera into his side as they turned and climbed the wooden staircase. Morval had offered them 2 bedrooms at the top of the house. Zane bit his tongue instead of asking for just one. He'd gotten used to her sleeping in the same vicinity of him these last few nights. He didn't want to be separated from her, especially not now. They reached the top step. Zane was unwilling to let go of her. Sera turned to look at him, those beautiful eyes filled with confusion and tiredness. Is everything going to be okay? She whispered. I really didn't know you believed me, right? Before he could answer, she shook her head with a soft laugh. I don't quite believe it myself. Zane hadn't even stopped to wonder if Sera could manipulate him in such a thorough way. He'd questioned her loyalty and motives before, but he couldn't any longer. What did that mean? He trusted her. It scared him more than he was willing to admit. Sleep, he insisted. We will figure this out together. She looked at him with surprise before her face broke out in a small smile. I'm supposed to be the one helping you. He stared at her, his chest tight with aching need. Sera knew she was all but drowning in his intense gaze. Zane used every ounce of restraint he possessed to pull away from her. I won't let anything happen to you. She squeezed his hand with grateful comfort before disappearing into the darkness of the bedroom beyond. Zane stood there for several minutes, fighting every impulse in his body to go after her. He let out a frustrated sigh before turning towards his own room and shutting the door with a soft thud. Morval's words about their connection haunted him, even in the deepest of